All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This channel is all about education, and we look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and try to figure out how to use them to our greatest advantage. And today is our 549th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. And Mr. Larson was an engineer in the US in the 20th century. He died back in 1990, but left behind many books on physics and chemistry and astronomy, also on metaphysics, including philosophy, religion, psychology, biology, and he's got a couple books on economics that we're looking at, one of those right now. But all of his books stem from the same theory. So he has one theory, overarching theory, and he plugs it into every subject. And his basic theory, he's one of the few scientists who has proposed a universe made out of not matter, not energy, not force, but motion, a universe of motion. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time. Think of speed. I was running at 10 miles per hour, 10 miles of space in 1 hour of time. Space over time is speed. That's a fraction with space as the numerator, time as the denominator. For Larson, all of our scientific quantities are fractions with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. That is a reciprocal relationship between space and time. So for Larson, matter, energy, force, acceleration, electric charge, magnetic flux, magnetic permeability, viscosity, heat, all of these things are fractions with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. And space or time can have multiple exponents. So you can have time to the third power over space to the third power. That's mass. You can have time over space to the fourth power. That is pressure. You can have space over time to the second power. That is acceleration. And so on and so forth. And so Larson builds his whole system out of that. He arrived at through a process of deduction, arrives at a theoretical universe about how the universe would look if his theories were correct. And then he compares his theoretical universe with the measured universe of modern science. He does this in some of his books on chemistry and astronomy. And in many cases, Larson is able to actually practically recreate the scientific tables from theory alone. Now, when he gets into writing about economics, he first wants to strip away all of the kind of philosophical and sociological aspects of economics and say, this is a science we're talking about. And just like any other science, you can't set your science up based on your opinion. It's got to be based on facts. Just like building a bridge or a house. If it's not in harmony with the laws of physics, it will collapse. And so too will your economic system. And so We've got to kind of get down to brass tacks and figure out what the economic system is based on, what the mechanisms are, and then harmonize with those. And then we can start to figure out, how to put our ideological preferences onto those things. But first it's got to comply with the laws of physics. And for Larson, the main law is work or starve. You have to produce something, or else you're going to starve to death. And this goes to what he calls the Robinson Crusoe situation, economics on a deserted island with one person. And then finally, or gradually, he complicates the situation, introducing first barter, and then money, and then employees into the situation, moving into a modern economic system. He arrives at a kind of a flow chart that shows the progress of an economic system, and he identifies the two reciprocal aspects of his economic system. Just like with the system in science, we're talking about space and time as the components of motion, the two reciprocal aspects of motion. In the economic motion, the two reciprocal aspects are production and consumption. And then he kind of goes from there. Now, this book is pretty much on macroeconomics. It's called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. And we're about to start chapter 13 of this book called Cost Inflation. So if you want to go back and check out the beginning, I'll go from all the beginning of this book. You want to go back about a month in the archives and start there. If you want to learn more about the reciprocal system in general, watch one of my first 474 videos on this subject. This is number 549. So go back at least, 3 months, 2.5, 3 months, and you'll get a longer description of how the reciprocal system operates and how he plugs it into science. Okay, we're going to start right here. Chapter 13, Cost Inflation. Today's chronic inflation is all the more uncanny because its nature is difficult to assess. This is a quote. So today's chronic inflation is all the more uncanny because its nature is difficult to assess. It does not fit into any conceptual cliche, but is something new in economic history. Only one thing is plain: slowly but inexorably, everything becomes more and more expensive. And that's the end of the quote. These words from a 1960 book by a German economist epitomize the lack of understanding of the inflation phenomenon that has bedeviled 20th century economic thought. The whole world is in the grip of something that simply does not fit into any pattern that current economic theory is able to assign to it. Almost everyone regards inflation as an evil, but neither economist, government official, nor layman has a clear idea of what causes it, or even just what it is. As a result, there is a widespread tendency to use the term inflationary in a pejorative rather than descriptive sense. Those who are opposed to a particular action condemn it as inflationary, while those who favor it are equally firm in their insistence that it is not inflationary. There is no indication that the situation is improving, either in understanding or in the results of attempts to deal with the problem. These comments indicate how matters now stand. From Samuelson and Nordhaus, quote, "There is wide disagreement among economists about the nature of inflation. And indeed, the problem seems to be getting worse over time, as higher and higher unemployment rates are necessary to restrain inflation. And from Heilbronner and Thoreau, there is no good consensus among economists as to the causes or even the mechanism of inflation comparable to the consensus that exists about many other kinds of problems. And I believe this is also from Heilbronner and Thoreau. Inflation has become intertwined with the problem of depression because we do not know how to control an inflationary propensity short of sending the economy into a tailspin. The truth is that economists and laymen alike have allowed themselves to be confused by an economic complexity that does not actually exist. The question as to whether or not an economic action is inflationary is a plain matter of fact. Inflation, as it has been defined herein, and as everyone knows without the need for any specific definition, is an increase in the general price level. That is, an increase in the ratio of purchasing power expended to goods received. Hence, if any action increases the flow of money purchasing power relative to the production of goods, it is inflationary. It raises the market prices level. If it decreases this ratio, it is deflationary. It reduces the market price level. If it has no effect on the ratio, either because it does not alter either component or because it affects both equally, then it is neither inflationary nor deflationary. It has no effect on the market price level. Whether or not the avowed purpose of the action meets with our approval is completely irrelevant. The whole subject of inflation can be reduced to easily understandable terms by making use of the cooling system analogy. As pointed out in Chapter 8, where this analogy was first introduced, the functional correlation is very close. Indeed, if we make the two small modifications of the usual gasoline engine cooling system that were previously described, we will have essentially perfect correspondence between it and the economic system from the standpoint of general operation. We can get a clear insight into the manner in which economic inflation originates if we simply take a look at what would be required if we deliberately undertook to inflate the cooling system. Such an inflation is, of course, a decrease in the BTU per gallon of water flow, equivalent to a decrease in the value of money, goods per dollar, in the economic system. One way of accomplishing the result would be to pump water out of the auxiliary tank that we installed and thereby swell the stream going to the radiator. This is analogous to the money inflation that we examined in Chapter 12. Or alternatively, we could change the setting of the thermostat that governs the relation between the water flow and the amount of heat to be removed. This alternate method of causing inflation in the cooling system is analogous to the economic process that we have defined as cost inflation, which is similarly due to an arbitrary action in resetting the economic thermostat that governs the production price, chiefly by the establishment of wage rates and the imposition of business taxes. Because of the finite size of the auxiliary water tank, withdrawals from the tank can take place only temporarily and in limited amounts. Continued use of this auxiliary system is therefore possible only on a cyclic basis, in which the tank is periodically refilled from the main stream. Inflation of the cooling system by this method must therefore be followed by deflation in a cooling cycle, analogous to the business cycle. No such limitation applies to the adjustment of the thermostat. Ultimately, the maximum capacity of the pump or the piping would be reached, but until then, the inflation could continue indefinitely, without any requirement that it must be followed by a deflation. The situation in the economic system is almost identical. For purposes of the discussion of cost inflation in this chapter, the most significant points brought out by the cooling system analogy are: 1, that cost inflation and money inflation are two separate and distinct economic phenomena. Even though both have the same ultimate result, they raise market prices. 2, cost inflation results from deliberate arbitrary actions, such as wage increases or imposition of business taxes, which raise the price level directly, reset the economic thermostat. And 3, there is practically no limit to the extent of the inflation that can take place by this means. Much of the current confusion with respect to the causes and effects of inflation is due to the lack of proper differentiation between cost inflation and money inflation. The man in the street often associates the word inflation with currency inflation, and it calls to mind such events as those which occurred prior to World War II in China and after the war in Germany, where the currency depreciated at an accelerating rate until it was finally worth no more than its value as waste paper. What this amounts to, that was after World War I there in Germany, but I think he said World War II. Either way, what this amounts to is government bankruptcy, and it comes about in the same way as individual bankruptcy. That is, the government tries to live on credit and continues spending in excess of its income until finally its credit collapses. Few governments have the ability and the fortitude to meet crises such as major wars with sound fiscal measures, and under these conditions they nearly always resort to the heavy use of credit, with the hope that the situation will not get out of hand. Sometimes, as in the World War II experience in the U.S., this hope is justified and the economy pulls through with no more than a severe money inflation. Sometimes there are narrow escapes, as in the case of the Civil War greenbacks, which depreciated to approximately 35 cents to the dollar before recovery set in, and sometimes the gamble loses, as in China and Germany. The economists recognize that our current problem is not currency inflation, but as a rule, they fail to distinguish clearly between cost inflation and money inflation. In fact, there are even contentions to the effect that it is not possible to distinguish clearly between the two. For example, William G. Bowen, in a book entitled The Wage Price Issue, tells us that it is impossible to allocate the responsibility for inflation between the demand-induced and the cost-induced components, and he concludes that it is clearly not possible to supply a clear, unequivocal answer to the question of who or what is the cause of upward price adjustments. As a result of the lack of differentiation between these two types of inflation, there has been a general tendency on the part of individual economists to concentrate on one of them, often concluding that it is the only source of inflation. Keynesians tend to concentrate on the demand mechanism in line with Keynes's strong emphasis on demand. Moulton, on the other hand, insisted that inflation is a cost phenomenon, relying more on empirical studies than on the theoretical approach favored by the Keynesians. He assembled an impressive mass of data to correlate general price rises with wage increases. But instead of interpreting this as an indication that wage increases are a cause of inflation, the irreproachable conclusion, he interpreted it as an indication that they are the cause of inflation. Our conclusion, he says, is that rising costs constitute the only pressure toward higher prices. Moulton's principal argument in favor of his conclusion is interesting, as it illustrates just what is wrong with much of the relatively minor effort that the economic profession does make to provide factual support for its conclusions. He points out that, except in a quite insignificant proportion of the total transactions, quote, the goods are priced before they reach the hands of merchants and dealers, end quote, and that the producers, quote, establish prices which will cover costs and leave a necessary margin for profits. From this, he concludes that there is, quote, no support for the thesis that consumer demand is the propelling force in price advances. Rather, the line of motivation runs from the costs side. Rising wages and other costs lead to compensating advances in wholesale prices, which in turn lead to markups through distributive channels to the ultimate retail outlets, end quote. It is evident that price increases can and do take place by means of this mechanism. This is cost inflation, as we have defined the term. But Moulton has made a mistake, one which is unfortunately all too common in physical science as well as in economics, by stopping as soon as he arrived at an explanation of price increases and not completing his analysis to determine whether there are other explanations. In his case, the mere fact that business enterprises frequently operate for a time at a net loss is sufficient evidence in itself to show that the producers are not in a position to, quote, establish prices which will cover costs and leave a necessary margin for profits. Obviously, some factor other than production costs is involved in market price changes. Reduced production costs certainly are not responsible for the catastrophic fall of the price level in a depression. One of the characteristic features of depressions that for many producers, the prices drop below the zero profit level. The facts cited by Moulton with respect to the retail price mechanism must therefore be open to a broader interpretation than that which he has placed upon them. And indeed, it is not difficult to see where he has gone astray. It is true, as he states, that goods are priced before they reach the retail merchants, and that all the latter do is to add their customary markups. But what he fails to recognize is that these pre-established prices are only tentative. In most of the American retail markets, the consumers do not normally have an opportunity to bargain over the prices, but they have the opportunity to accept or reject them. If they will not or cannot buy in sufficient quantities at the established prices, the producers must reduce those prices and content themselves with smaller profits. If the acceptance is better than anticipated, they can give consideration to increasing the prices and improving their profit margins. Thus, regardless of the fact that the operation of the pricing mechanism is in the hands of the producers, it is the consumers who have the ultimate control. In essence, the market system is simply a gigantic Dutch auction. Unless the increase in price is exorbitant, the average consumer does not ordinarily refuse to buy something that he definitely wants. If he has the purchasing power readily available, he may grumble, but he buys just the same. If the total purchasing power remains unchanged, the higher price that has to be paid for this item means that consumers must reduce their purchases of other items. This forces a reduction in the prices of these other items and initiates a competitive round of repricing that ultimately arrives at a new equilibrium between the prices of different goods, leaving the average price level just where it was to begin with. But if the amount of purchasing power available to the consumers changes in parallel with the price increase, the result is different. As in this case, the average price level adjusts itself to the new amount of purchasing power. This explains the very different effect of the two basic types of inflation on real income: the wage increases and associated items that cause cost inflation give consumers in general the exact amount of additional purchasing power that is necessary in order to meet the inflationary rise that takes place in the market price level. That is, real income is unchanged. No alternation of consumers' buying habits is therefore necessary, aside from the effects of the transfer of income from certain groups to others because of the selective nature of wage increases. Money inflation, on the other hand, reduces the real purchasing power of the recipients of earned income wages, rent, interest, profits, etc., by the amount of goods diverted to those who get the benefit of the money purchasing power drawn from the reservoirs. Business as a whole is similarly unaffected by cost inflation, and this adds to the income of the producers in the same measure that it adds to their costs. Money inflation likewise adds to income, but has little effect on costs. Hence, business enterprises are abnormally prosperous during a boom, but when this situation is reversed in a recession and income drops without a corresponding reduction in costs, they suffer, sometimes very severely. It should be remembered in this connection that only a small percentage of the total income of a business finds its way into the profits of the enterprise under normal conditions, and a relatively small drop in gross receipts without a corresponding reduction in costs is therefore sufficient to wipe out profits altogether. Mitchell poses a question here. Quote, "But granted so much," he says, "why cannot businessmen defend their profit margins against the threatened encroachments of cost by marking up selling prices?" Once squarely put, this question is not easy to answer squarely. It sounds well to say that the advance of selling prices cannot be continued indefinitely, but this plausible statement challenges the abrupt question, why not? End quote. Mitchell's inability to see the answer to this question was another result of the economist's insistence on viewing the establishment of the general price level as a composite of the market prices of the individual goods, and therefore a matter of supply and demand. This is another of the places where they have arrived at wrong conclusions because they apply supply and demand reasoning to situations in which supply and demand are not relevant. The concepts of supply and demand are not applicable to goods in general because, in real terms, the only measurement that is meaningful in this connection, the supply of goods in general, the goods as goods, is the demand, the goods as purchasing power. Once wages are set and the most efficient production methods have been put into effect, there is nothing more than that the producers can do to influence the general price level, and their own individual prices must be consistent with this general level regardless of the effect on their profits. If the general level of production costs rises because of wage or tax increases, they can raise their prices accordingly, since the additional money purchasing power necessary to sustain the higher prices is automatically available. Price increases of this kind, cost inflation, can be continued indefinitely, but price increases cannot be made in the face of deflationary conditions of the kind to which Mitchell referred. Indeed, price increases are unavoidable because the money purchasing power flowing to the goods markets under these conditions is not sufficient to maintain the existing price level. Businessmen cannot do anything about this price situation. They simply have to conform to the requirements of the markets. Summarizing the foregoing discussion, we may say that cost inflation causes a permanent increase in the price level, but this type of inflation is not damaging to the economy as a whole. Money inflation is damaging, but not permanent. It must inevitably be followed by deflation. Although cost inflation proceeding concurrently may prevent an actual fall in the price level. Either type of inflation creates serious inequities between individuals and between economic groups. Since there is more than one type of inflation, there is also more than one kind of economic stability that can be achieved by eliminating the causes of inflation. Usually the word stability is interpreted in terms of business stability, that is, elimination of the cycles of boom and recession. As pointed out in Chapter 11, the answer to this stability problem is to take compensatory action to offset any unbalanced flow into or out of the money reservoirs. Such action will not keep the market prices at any fixed average level, but will keep market prices in balance with production prices, so that the rate of money purchasing power flow will be the same in all parts of the circuit, and there will always be enough money purchasing power entering the markets to buy the full amount of current production at the full production price, including normal profits. This kind of stability benefits almost every participant in economic activity, at least in the long run, and as will be brought out later, there are available practical methods of accomplishing the stabilization which are quite unobtrusive and have no undesirable collateral effects. Furthermore, business stabilization is a prerequisite for development of any practical program for maintaining employment at the optimum level. It does not appear, therefore, that there is any reasonable doubt as to the advisability of putting such a program into effect, and it has been assumed for purposes of the subsequent discussion that the decision makers, the general public, in this instance, will accept this kind of stability as a desirable economic objective. Okay, we're going to stop right there. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a